Alright, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome again. We talked about relative clauses in our last class at Universitas Muhammadiyah, and of course it raised some more questions. So I would like to try to explain some of the difficulties. Alright, remember relative clause. Let's take a look at this sentence. My friend who is a doctor visited me. Alright, what is the main sentence here? What's going on in this sentence? Let's look for the main verb. Visited. Who visited? Okay, my friend. My friend visited me. That's the main idea. That's the independent clause. We see we have a relative pronoun here, and we see we've got the relative clause. Who is a doctor? Now remember, relative clauses work like adjectives because they give more information about the noun. My friend who is a doctor. Okay, that tells me my tall friend, my fat friend, my friend who is a doctor. That's the relative clause. Now, so far so good. The difficulty arose when we started to think about using who or whom. And that gets tricky for native speakers too. In America, we don't really use whom anymore. It has fallen out of favor in the English language because whom sounds like you're trying to be someone, a big shot. To whom am I speaking? It sounds archaic, old-fashioned. It sounds like you're being pretentious. So it doesn't really occur as much anymore. Consequently, we are a little unclear sometimes how to use it. But the simple explanation is we use who whenever we want to replace the subjective case, and we use whom for objective case. Like this, my friend who is a doctor, because it's in the subjective case. We're talking about friend. The tricky part comes like this. The boy who or whom I talked to sat in the library. Well, you might think that it should be who because it's talking about the boy, and the boy is in the subjective case. The boy is the subject of the sentence. However, the whole thing is in the context of a different clause. It's in a dependent clause. So, the boy sat in the library, that's the main sentence. We're going to put that aside and try to figure out whether to use who or whom in its own dependent clause. And really, when you look at that, it changes your decision. Because if we diagram this, we notice in the dependent clause the verb here is talked. Okay? Now who talked? I talked. I talked to, and then we realize that it's actually in the objective case, isn't it? That's the trick. So, the boy whom I talked to sat in the library. The rule to follow, when you have a choice in a dependent relative clause, whether to use who or whom, you don't pay attention to the independent clause. You just look inside its own dependent clause and determine whether it's subject or object there. Now, there is one other thing. Another question that came up, when to use commas and when not to use commas in relative clauses. Okay? Easy enough? Yeah, we'll see. Alright. My friend who is a doctor visited me. Who is a doctor? You have to determine, is the information essential to the meaning of the whole thing? If it is called a restrictive or essential relative clause, and no commas are necessary. This won't make sense yet. If the information is not really necessary, it's called non-essential or non-restrictive relative clause. Let me give an example. This will clear up if I talk long enough, okay? Alright. My friend who is a doctor visited me. It's not really essential to the meaning of the main point, my friend visited me. That's the main point of this sentence. Who is a doctor is just extra information. Think of it like this. If you can say, by the way, then you use commas. Just like this. Okay? Watch. My friend who is a doctor visited me. Think of it like that. We don't really need to know he's a doctor. The main point is my friend visited me. So, if that's the case, if it's one of those parenthetical asides, by the way, you use the commas. If, however, it's important, if you have to have it in the sentence, for the sentence to mean what you want it to mean, you don't use commas. The boy whom I talked to sat in the library. If I didn't say whom I talked to, you wouldn't know which boy I'm talking about. We need that phrase with a clause. We need it to identify that particular boy. It is essential information. And if that's the case, we do not use commas because we have to have it in there. Does that make sense? I'm not going to give another example because I'm afraid I'll confuse the issue even more. But let's move on to the third question that came up. When to use that and when to use which. The cat which ate the bird died, or the cat that ate the bird died. This is related to whether it is restrictive or non-restrictive relative clause. And it's pretty simple. If it is involved in an essential part, if it's essential, if it's necessary to be in the sentence, you use that. Because that sounds more specific. So, the cat which ate the bird died, that would be if the information is not essential to the sentence. But the cat that ate the bird died. We have to know which cat we're talking about. So we have to say the cat that ate the bird. That's the one that died. Okay, let's try a few ourselves. Alright. Jenny, who is a pretty girl, has fallen. Okay. The question is, do we use commas or not? Let's identify the relative clause. Who is a relative pronoun, so Jenny, who is a pretty girl. Jenny has fallen. So, Jenny, who is a pretty girl, has fallen. Do we really need to know that she's pretty in this case? My camera person is mouthing the word no, and she is correct. So, if that's true, if it's not really essential, if I say Jenny, who by the way is a pretty girl, has fallen, then we just set it off with commas. That's how we use it, because this is a non-restrictive or non-essential relative clause. Okay, good. This book, oh, we have two questions here. This book, which or that, is the novel I read last week, is the one I like best. Okay. This book, that is the novel I read last week, is the one I like best. Do we really need to know that I read it last week? This book, the novel I read last week. This is a judgment call, really. I'm glad this question came up because sometimes it really could go either way. It depends on what you mean by it. You the writer. Let's say that I want it to be non-essential. So I'm going to say, this book, by the way, I read it last week, so I'll offset it with commas. If I do that, do I use which or that? Now, I've said a lot of things. One of the things I said earlier was, if it is essential to the meaning, we use that because it's more specific. However, since I determined that I wanted to make it really non-essential, then we're going to use which. So, this book, which is the novel I read last week, is the one I like best. Okay, good. My sister, who lives in Sumatra, has 2 daughters. Now, you might be thinking, who cares if she lives in Sumatra? That's not the important information. But it is. And this is where we have to think about it. Maybe I have 5 sisters. I need to determine, I need to identify which sister I'm talking about. I've got a sister that lives in Sumatra, I've got one in Java, I've got one in Probolinggo, so I have to tell you that it's the sister who lives in Sumatra. Otherwise, the information is not complete. That's how we use it. And since it is absolutely essential, it restricts the meaning to that. It can only be that sister. So we do not use commas. Okay. Okay. Let's run through these and be done with it. Alright? Here we go. These are your choices. You're going to plug in the appropriate word. That, whose, which, or who. It's your choice. One of these will not be used. Alright. Number 1. I talked to the girl, blank car crashed. What do you think? I talked to the girl that car crashed. I talked to the girl whose car crashed. I talked to the girl which car crashed. Or I talked to the girl who car crashed. Now, you're talking about the girl. You're replacing it with girl, so it's going to be like siapa, like a who kind of thing. I'm glad I brought this up because that's when we use whose. Whose shows possession. Okay? Now, it's her car. The car belongs to her. So, we say whose. Because whose is a relative pronoun that shows possession of something. The girl's car. Whose car crashed. So, it sounds so nice. It's perfect English. I talked to the girl whose car crashed. That's nice. Eliminate that. Number 2. Mr. Jokel, blank is a becak driver, lives next door. Okay? Mr. Jokel's a person, so siapa, who? But I have another question. Do we offset this with commas or not? Let's look. Mr. Jokel, who is a becak driver, lives next door. Mr. Jokel lives next door. That's really the essential meaning of this. I think that he's a becak driver in this case. You know, by the way, he's a becak driver. Okay? So, do we need commas? We do need commas for this because it's non-essential. Mr. Jokel, who's a becak driver, lives next door. Okay. Number 3. Thanks for your email. That was interesting. Or thanks for your email, which was interesting. Now, I think the important thing here is thank you for your email. I think the fact that I'm commenting on it being interesting is just icing on the cake. It's just a little extra. So it's non-essential. In that case, do I use that or do I use which? I can almost hear you through the YouTube. Yes, which? Because it's not essential information being interesting. Okay? Thanks for your email, which was interesting. Thanks for your attention, and thanks for your interest. And I will see you in class.